Hey everyone, I'm Andrew Montalenti, co-founder, CTO of Parsely, and we're here to talk about analytics for online journalism. So Parsely is probably a bit of the kind of new kid on the block when it comes to analytics tools at this conference anyway. We've been around kind of with the product in the market since January of 2012 when we first launched Dash, which is our real-time analytics system specifically for online media companies. And we've been in the market now for over 18 months or so with that product that's been continually refined and improved. And we also offer to publishers not just great analytics that can help them understand the impact of their journalism, but also a rich data and API platform that lets them build really nice site features as well. And what we're going to focus our talk on is a concept that we've been working on with Adam over at Atlantic Media. And it's really, Adam is the one who came up with the concept, and we just helped refine it with data and with our tool a little bit, called ratiometrics. And ratiometrics is basically an application of this sort of baseball or sabermetrics or Moneyball model to online content. So that's what we're going to get into in the second half of the talk here. So just really quickly, the Parsely story. As a company, we're founded by complete non-media insiders, right? Basically, my co-founder and I are both news junkies. And once upon a time, I worked at a high school newspaper as the editor-in-chief, so fell in love with journalism kind of early, right? And then basically, we built a company over the course of a few years that really focused on measuring the impact of content online and making sure that that content's impact is basically as big as possible, and making sure that journalists have the tools they need to really get their job done in the best way possible. And so we empower editors, writers, and analysts with data. We liberate product teams from CMS limitations. I'm sure a lot of you have been frustrated by your CMSs in the past. And our simple API actually pulls all the data out of your website, understands all of your content, and then merges it with traffic data and social data so that basically you can have a data-driven approach to recommending content to your users, to your readers, without having to do like a massive CMS re-engineering project that might cost you millions of dollars and never go anywhere, right? And then we want to share insights with customers as well. So actually just last month, we launched something called the Authority Report, which there's going to be a link to that at the end of the slides. It's just at Parsely/Authority. And that's basically a report where we tell journalists and media company owners about what we're seeing across our network of 5 billion page views and 160 million unique visitors, tracking from over 200 news websites, premium news websites on the web, basically telling you where their traffic is coming from, what the major insights are that we can see for content over time. And then the last point is we're not an ad network. The reason I put that down is because I find that in the media industry, you guys get seduced by a lot of tools, and then those tools end up becoming ad networks somehow. And then it's basically there's a kind of bait and switch that happens that I hear a lot of editors and journalists talk about. So we really are making our company mission, making online journalism work through data, right? And so that's kind of what we're going to do, do our darndest to accomplish over the next few years. So what kind of data can you get in Parsely? So you can get real-time time series data, like you see at the top. That's a screenshot from our Pulse tool, which can show you essentially every single story on your site and how those stories are contributing to your overall traffic. Our tool is also intelligent and identifies peaks in your traffic so that you can see stories that are really specifically contributing to your traffic and trends. We do benchmarking, where we actually help journalists understand whether they did better this week over last week. And we're trying to do something here where you don't have to invest, again, lots of money in having a fancy analyst team kind of pour over the data just to get a single report that tells a journalist or an editor whether they're doing better. We also do social data, so we pull in social share data from Facebook, Twitter, Google+, Pinterest, StumbleUpon, et cetera, and we overlay all that data with your traffic. Basically, we realize that there's a wide tapestry of data points available on the web that could be relevant for you guys, and so we try to pull all that stuff together. The other thing that's very unique about Parsely is that we also do semantic metadata. And what that means, it's kind of a fancy term that basically means we crawl your site. And we get all that data out of the CMS that has always been really, really hard to put into an analytics system in the past. So for example, we pull out the title of every article, the full text, to actually analyze the topics you're writing about. Are you, when you write about sports, is a specific sports team doing better than another in terms of coverage? When you write about politics, is it one candidate or another that's drawing users back? We look at the pub date of articles so that we can let you filter out evergreen posts or focus on them. We look at author data so that we can produce personalized weekly digests for each author, which I'll have Mike talk about shortly. And we also pull out section and tag metadata and a few other things. And actually, section and tags are pretty nice because that's how we were able to do some of this baseball-style ratio metrics reporting that Adam will talk about shortly. So this is just a quick, I'll just walk through a couple of quick screens without doing a demo, right? This is a quick screen of Pulse, which is our real-time analytics screen that focuses on only posts published in the last 24 hours. And then, of course, you can also break out aggregates by author, section, tag, refer. You can see posts that are coming from Facebook and things of that nature. This is Glimpse, and there's been a lot of talk today about kind of socializing data and getting data into the newsroom. So this was a specific product we built for that kind of HD screen use case. It's meant to tile out on a big screen and show you some key metrics on the left, your sort of placement in a month over month and day over day at the top, a benchmark of the current day and how you're trending for traffic versus a week ago, a list of the most recent articles and whether they're going up or down in traffic right now, and then some summaries of where your traffic came from. And then you can actually, some people run this on a second monitor on their desk, and then you can actually click in on any one of these articles and get the full historical breakdown. Why did the traffic end up that way? Where did they come from, et cetera? Now, I mentioned the API, and so one of our biggest API users, which I like talking about because they are just such a great site and I read them every day, is arstechnica.com, which is a Condé Nast-owned tech news site. And they did a redesign a year ago or so and basically built everything that's a dynamic site feature using the Parsely API. And so they use Dash, our analytics tool internally from an editorial standpoint, but they also make recommendations to users that look like this that are at the footer of their article pages. And we expose this as a pure API, so you can deeply integrate it into your site and make it look however you want, and you can see that there's actually different article types recommended. And there's just a lot that you can do with it. And so what ours actually did is for their loyal audience, they built a personalization toolbar, which is called My Stories. And they actually use our API to figure out what are the news stories since the last visit on arstechnica.com. And basically, this is the stuff that you might have missed because it only appeared recently, right? And they also make personalized recommendations on the right, which can tell users interesting articles that they should read using all of that topic metadata I mentioned earlier. So we're actually analyzing all those articles and understanding, hey, this person really likes articles about Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks and that sort of storyline. So maybe we can make some personalized recommendations that way. And so now I'll turn it over to Mike, who could talk a little bit about weekly digests for a few minutes.
Sure. Working okay? The weekly digest, so I actually came before I jumped onto Parsely. I came from the publisher side, so I worked at Rogers Media and then the Globe and Mail up in Canada. And one of the things I wanted the most before joining Parsely was I wanted vertical-specific analytics tools that were kind of meant for what I was working on. And so a common frustration that I'd have with GA, Omniture, anybody that I had to work with is just that idea that I didn't have something that was just tailored to the problems that I needed, right? And so you end up getting into that thing where you're building massive numbers of dashboards or customizing Excel spreadsheets and things like that to try to get to what you want. And so the weekly digest that we tried to put together here, which you can run for any author, section, or tag on your site, is meant to give as best a contextualized view of how well are you performing as the manager of that tag, the author himself or herself, or the manager of that section. So some of the metrics that you'll see, and we still debate these actually to this day, whether we'll include other ones or remove what we've got there. So you can start to see, total page views that you've got, whether that's actually trending up or down, the trend over the last 12 weeks. We look at the volume of content that you're actually publishing within whatever the period is that you've got selected. And then finally, one thing that we actually do here, which we've talked about a little bit in some of the posts, and Adam's actually going to hit on it quite a bit with ratio metrics, is the idea of median views per post compared to average views per post. And it's come up a lot, and we've had customers kind of ask us, why would you guys choose the median? It's more, it's a little bit more confusing. Averages are much easier to understand. And the response we usually give is that the average is just too easy to game. If you're a section editor who just happens to always be featured on the home page, your average page views for your report are going to be constantly gamed by that number, and you're always going to show up as an awesome writer. If you happen to work a beat that just isn't usually picked up by your homepage editor, it's going to be a lot tougher to move that number. Now, moving something like the median views per post, which for those of you who are unfamiliar, if you take all your posts, you arrange them from smallest to largest, median would be the post that you have in the middle. So then the middle version of your, or sorry, it's another way of looking at your average, but yes, the middle version of your page views. It's a much harder number to actually game over time, and to do it, you'd actually have to move your entire long tail of content, not just the stuff that you're maybe working on that got picked up by the homepage. And so then finally, week at a glance, you're also seeing just a general view of how the current week performed, and then the performance context versus the previous 4 weeks as well.
Yeah. And one comment on this really quickly, which is one of the things that we found is putting a screen like that dashboard screen in your newsroom so that everyone can see the data is certainly a good way to start conversations about data. But actually having every single author and section editor receive their own personalized slice of analytics data that's only relevant to the content they can actually have an effect on is a great way to start conversations about data. And it's not just doing lip service to a pretty screen up on a dash or up on a TV or something like that. It's actually creating conversations, right? And I think a lot of our editors and writers, they talk about this data and they try to understand and dig into it. And on the kind of full version of it, you can actually see where all your traffic came from, right? Such as social sources and search and all of that. The other nice thing is that this data kind of goes to some of the things I heard earlier, which is, to what degree should journalists obsess over analytics? And the Parsely perspective is not much, right? I think that the Parsely perspective is that you guys should be creating great content every day. And you should ideally be using a tool that guides you there, but doesn't basically monopolize your time. And so what we've tried to do with the Weekly Digest is this visualization, we actually did some technical work to make it so these visualizations go right into your email inbox. You don't even have to click onto the Parsely website in order to see this. It just appears in Gmail the way you're seeing it here. And so we actually don't want you to go into the dashboard. We want you to just get the data and kind of understand what's going on and have those conversations, because we're doing the hard work of cleaning up the data, making it look good, making it presentable. And we're going to keep building tools in that vein so that actually the data starts to have behavioral changes aside from chasing clicks and kind of strategically moving things around on an incremental basis. We kind of want to go for the holistic organizational change, which can come from looking at data. And I think that that'll leave you guys all working on great content instead. So let's see. Now over to Adam.
All right. Thank you much. You want me to drive?
Yeah.
Perfect.
There you go.
Does this do what I think it does?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right, so Atlantic Media actually has several sites. We have the Atlantic.com, the Atlantic Wire, the Atlantic Cities. Separately, we have National Journal, Government Executive, Defense One, NextGov, and Quartz. Did I get them all? Okay, yeah, so 8 sites. Any one of those would be enough on its own to keep me busy, because any of these sites alone, the Atlantic in any given month might produce 900, 1,000 pieces of content. The Atlantic Wire will do that. National Journal will do that. Trying to keep track of all that content at the same time is going to be overwhelming. It's been said numerous times so far today that we're sitting on an absolute trove of data and in many cases have no idea what the heck to do with it. So we need to figure out a way to kind of normalize this data and take a look at it. So one of the things that's very interesting to me is that psychologically, most people, editors, analysts, anybody, has a tendency to focus in on the major successes, the home run piece. Ron, I believe you referred to it earlier, which is great because I'm going to segue real into hardcore baseball stuff momentarily. But you've got a whole lot more content than just your home run piece, or even your singles pieces, pieces that kind of meet that minimum success threshold. I think Mike is actually spot on when he says you need to focus on the median piece of content rather than the average piece of content. Ideally, you would hope that all of your content is normally distributed, so your median and your average fall pretty close to one another. But in practice, at least within Atlantic Media, and I suspect within a lot of your sites as well, that's not what happens. We get very significant left tails with all of our content. So if you look going on here, I've ordered all of our content on The Atlantic, Wire, Cities, and removing all the stuff that's behind the paywall, which is kind of an unfair comparison, otherwise you have a much smaller audience, on National Journal, and just ranking everything from the piece of content that was published that got the least number of page views up to content that got by far the most amount of page views. So if you look at that first decile, the first through the 10th percentile, up through the 10th decile, the 90th up through the 99th percentile, almost all of the actual overall traffic to your site happens between that 80th and 99th percentile. So if you're looking at the average page views, it's going to be skewed massively by what's going on over here. And it's real fascinating to look at the home run and say, hey, home runs are great, let's do more of these, let's get these viral stories. But if we could do home runs and viral stories all the time, we would be doing that, and we wouldn't be sitting at 12, 13, 14 million uniques per month. We'd be at 70, 80, 200 million because we'd just be hitting viral stuff out of the park nonstop. Obviously, that's not realistic, and at a certain point, once something goes viral, you lose control over it. You hope that you get a lot of traffic out of it, you cross your fingers, and you just kind of ride off the wave and see how long the duration for your viral piece is going to go and what the magnitude is going to be. So I think more often, the more actionable items are not what's going on here in the 9th and the 10th deciles, but why are things not doing so well in the 1st and 2nd deciles? What can we do between the 1st and the 8th decile to actually focus on that section of content so that they can become, rather than borrowing some more baseball parlance, instead of strikeouts, turn them into singles, turn your singles into doubles, your doubles into triples. There's a whole lot more content to actually do stuff with on that end of the spectrum than there is over here, which is why I think the median is a lot more important. You can look at just content velocity and say, okay, well, if we're producing X amount of posts per month, then we should get something that goes viral and some pieces that don't go viral. But again, not all content is created equal. We have 2 stories here that did very well, and they're in no way, shape, or form like one another. We have this graph on the left, my favorite chart ever. Percent chance that each of these bars reaches the top. There's no commentary to this graph. Literally, this post went up. Hey, here's a funny picture, and it got 200,000 page views, which is pretty successful. Separate to that, we have a story that went up a few months ago by Connor, and that got 1 million+ page views. There's a lot more content here that I didn't paste in because you'd be pasting down here, I'd be going through the floor and wrapping around. It's several pages worth of article in contrast with this guy. So certainly there's a time investment factor that this probably took more than 10, 11 times the amount of time to write this story than it did to post this graph over here. But you can't constantly post long articles and say, okay, these are going to do very well. I've written some long articles myself that didn't do so well, much to my chagrin. And you can't just post these little one-off graphs all the time because even if they do well at a certain point, that's not the brand that people are going to be coming to theatlantic.com to look for. There's folks that do play in that sphere and they do a very good job of it, but that's not necessarily us. So you can't just look at length of post. You need to figure out other ways to kind of normalize this, getting away from outside just content velocity. So what we wanted to start doing was trying to do kind of a Moneyball approach. Now, unfortunately for me, I'm a little bit more Jonah Hill than I am Brad Pitt, but we do what we can here. So the central premise of Moneyball was that there was a metric that was significantly undervalued in baseball, which was on-base percentage, which basically means when a batter comes up to the plate, his sole goal is to just not make an out. If he can figure out a way to reach base, whether it's a walk, a single, a double, getting hit by a pitch, that's all great. So on-base percentage was undervalued, and the Oakland Athletics early on were able to leverage players that had not necessarily great batting averages, but very high on-base percentages, and compete in a much more unfair landscape than what the New York Yankees might have with their inflated payroll. My ratio metrics approach, which really there's nothing special to this, I'm really in many cases just cribbing language from baseball, but I tried to use ratio metrics instead of batting average and slugging percentage, so as not to have all of you flee screaming from the room if you don't like baseball. But it's again what I've been saying the whole time is that home runs kind of get overestimated. They're nice to look at. We all want to turn on SportsCenter and look at the walk-off home runs, but they're kind of once in a blue moon, and you can't necessarily take lessons from those home runs because they're the 95th through 99th percentile of what happened, and if we could do it, we'd be doing it all the time. So we have 4 separate metrics, all of which are cribbed directly from baseball. We have batting average, slugging percentage, Average plus slugging, those of you that are baseball fans will recognize that I've bastardized on base percentage plus slugging, but it's not a perfect match between baseball and ratio metrics. And then isolated power. Each of these in baseball and analytics represent different things. Batting average basically is just how often can you get a hit over the number of attempts. So on the Atlantic versus National Journal versus Quartz, we have different thresholds based on audience size and what we would consider success to be. On a site like National Journal, we might consider success to be getting 8,000 page views for a given story. But on the Atlantic, we might consider it 15,000 page views, so it's a larger site. So anything that gets a hit, whether it gets 15,000 on the Atlantic up to 1 million, it still counts as just one hit, and that contributes towards batting average. On the other hand, we have slugging percentage, where you actually want to reward people for hitting that home run piece, because a home run is, in fact, substantively better than hitting a single. So if you get something that goes viral and gets 1 million page views, then you should be rewarded for that, and so it gets weighted more heavily. So in baseball, you get 4 bases for a home run, so you would count that as 4 hits rather than just 1 hit. Average plus slugging is basically the best of both worlds. It tells you not only how often that you might succeed, but when you do succeed, how often you kind of go beyond that minimum success threshold. And this is actually a really good metric to look at in baseball as well. If you look at people historically who have the highest on-base percentage plus slugging, it's the Babe Ruths of the world, it's the Lou Gehrig's of the world, it's the folks that even if you have no idea, a ball from a strike, these are at least names that you've heard of. And this maps pretty well onto ratio metrics as well for analytics. And then lastly, we have isolated power, which measures how powerful somebody is in terms of being able to go viral. If they are successful frequently, maybe they're a columnist with a very tiny loyal following. That loyal following will come back over and over again to get a hit for the batting average, but it's always a bunch of singles because that loyal following hasn't necessarily grown over much. So again, we've got different classifications here. Here's where it starts to kind of break out from the baseball model. I'm using outs, singles, doubles, triples, and home runs because it intuitively makes sense to me. In many cases, I try and force things into a baseball model, much to the chagrin of some of our Canadian editors who really wish I could do something with hockey, but sadly I don't know that quite so well. What's important here is that you just have multiple levels of success. We all generally intuitively know what an out is. You post something, it doesn't do quite so well as what you might have hoped. Okay, this was unsuccessful, let's learn from that. And we know what our home runs are. If you're thinking, viral stories, you can tell when something has gone absolutely nuts. You know what that is. In between, what your thresholds are between singles, doubles, and triples, that's going to depend largely on what your newsroom decides is the difference between a single, double, and a triple. There isn't really any mathematical reason to have this, just kind of a gut feeling in terms of where do I want to set my thresholds. What is substantively different from a double versus a single? Or if you don't think you have different thresholds, you could just do out plus single plus home run. Or if you've got multiple thresholds, you could do the same thing and have baseball essentially with 8 bases. You'd have doubles, triples, singles, quadruples, quintuples, etc. So we're not necessarily married to this model so much as we are the idea that there's different levels of success that each individual editor, each individual analyst is going to have the idea of how to actually approach this. A couple ways you want to address this. We have norm reference versus criteria referenced. So criteria reference is already what I just talked about, where you might say, come hell or high water, if this doesn't get 5,000 page views, that's my criteria, that's going to be a single, which is fine, except sometimes on National Journal, which is a politics and policy-oriented site, if I'm doing this 12 months ago, we're in the middle of a general election season for the presidency, you're going to expect to get a lot more than 5,000 page views on any given story because you've got something that's going to be driving the news cycle. Criteria reference doesn't necessarily grow with, in fact, it doesn't grow with what's going on the site. So you might want to use norm reference and say anything greater than the 50th percentile or 75th percentile on the site becomes my success. And that way, if you have a bunch of traffic, everything shifts along with it. When the general election season ends and all your traffic downshifts as you expect, or when Congress is out of session and traffic downshifts, you still have norm reference that works appropriately. Lastly, as Mike said, we have positional qualifications, because if somebody is writing for a beat that doesn't get a whole lot of traffic or doesn't get a whole lot of play on the homepage, it's not necessarily fair to look at that person and say, this is unsuccessful, this story is unsuccessful, this subject matter is unsuccessful. Whereas if you're writing something that's going to be pretty clear clickbait, that's going to be pretty obviously inflated in terms of the amount of traffic that it might generate. This is kind of the same way that the St. Louis Cardinals are more or less willing to tolerate Pete Kozma at shortstop, even though the guy can't hit particularly well because he can play shortstop, whereas they wouldn't do that at first base. So you can have all your various out singles, doubles, triples, but just have a way to actually contextualize all of this. So here's two separate things that we can look at. We can look at what we have on Quartz, and then we can look at what we have in terms of the Atlantic. So Quartz has a little bit over 3 million uniques per month right now, has grown at a huge pace. A couple months ago, we had a story on bee colony death. Maybe 800 words, not a huge long article, certainly very, very well written, very interesting article, but it set an Atlantic media record for traffic. Got 2.5 million page views in the span of about 72 hours. I've never seen anything like it. I spent a good 2 or 3 days going through the data and trying to make sure that it wasn't some kind of weird denial of service attack all hitting the bees story, because I couldn't make rhyme or reason out of it. But no, it's totally legitimate. But again, we have this fixation on page views if we're not looking at ratio metrics, other ways to kind of normalize our content. If we look at just that 80th, 90th, 99th percentile of content, we're going to do something that's not necessarily the best idea in the world. We've got this bee story that got 2.5 million page views, hugely successful. We're all patting ourselves on the back. In the next couple of months, we've written 3 more stories about bees. Turns out bees aren't that interesting. This story was. And if we look at just the average number of page views that bees give you, it's still going to have a huge average because this is going to be driving that average all the way to the right. It's like that graph I showed you to begin with. It's not normally distributed. You've got a whole bunch at the very upper end of the spectrum. If we look at the batting average if we look at the batting average on this, it's just 1 for 4. We've got 1 massively successful story and 3 stories that weren't necessarily so successful. So just focusing on the 80th, 90th, 99th percentile is fun and interesting, and we feel good about ourselves when we hit these home runs, but it doesn't necessarily work so well. So what we've built into Parsely Dash, you can look at really any unit of analysis. You can look at authors or site sections, or in many cases what I think is most interesting, tags, keywords, and headlines, and see what's actually successful. And we can look at a couple of our channels. We have the entertainment channel up top, and then we have the sexist channel. The sexist being a much newer channel, which is why you've got 425 posts in comparison to almost 2,500 posts for entertainment. It hasn't been in existence for quite so long. But if you look at the batting average on entertainment, it's batting about 500. Now, I'm cheating a little bit with this. I set this to norm reference. So batting 500 basically just means that roughly half of all the content is above the median, half of all is not. But if you look at the sexist content, almost 3/4 of the sexist content relative to the median site piece of content is doing well better than the median. So what this suggests to me is that there's still a lot of appetite for content on the sexist channel. Yes, it's a new channel, but we haven't reached that saturation point. We can keep posting new things to the sexist channel and drive a whole lot of traffic. So we've got 2,500, another 2,000 on the health channel, another 2,000 on the technology channel. All told, we're looking at about 15,000 posts right here, but without having to look at all 15,000 individually, which is just a completely onerous task. We wouldn't be able to get any meaningful data out of that. We can aggregate these all into meaningful sets of data, sub-aggregations, and figure out what channels do well, what channels might do successfully for singles versus channels that have very shareable viral content, hit a lot of home runs. What I think is most interesting is we can look at individual topics. We can look at tags within Parsely Dash, or we can peel out keywords out of our headlines. So I'm actually switching from the Atlantic on the previous page over to National Journal. And if we look at individual words that popped up in headlines frequently, we see scandals, Boston, Republican, GOP, et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at the relative efficacy of Republican versus GOP, which are synonyms, unless you have a very tiny amount of space that you can only fill and you need to use GOP instead of Republican, what this suggests to me is that all else equal, if we have the room for it, when we're writing headlines, we should use the word Republican rather than GOP because it performs so much better. So this can help you with headline writing and figuring out how you actually want to set up tags that might necessarily tell the exact same story but use different sets of words, and you can compare them against each other with pretty significant data sets within maybe just 1-2 months worth of content. That said, you need to have some context to this. Boston on the second line is not necessarily inherently interesting, but unfortunately I took this during the month where we had the bombings in Boston after the marathon. So there does need to be some editorial context and some input as to, okay, why is some of this actually showing up? Republican and GOP on National Journal, that's going to show up all the time. It's a politics and policy site. Boston, if you wrote a story about Boston right now, I'm reasonably certain it wouldn't do nearly as well because there's not necessarily a newsworthy story that's driving all that traffic. So the ratio metrics approach allows you to do a whole lot more with all of your data rather than just focusing on the 80th, 90th, 99th percentile of all of your data. And Parsely allows us to aggregate all of that together, whether your unit of analysis is authors, sections, keywords, individual topics that are in the post, et cetera.